It was a day like any other. The people of Pompeii woke up with the sun. Some went to fetch water from the public fountains. The streets were crowded and full of people jostling for goods at the market or stopping to gossip with friends. But something was wrong. The ground had been rumbling all morning, and some of the locals reported seeing odd things, figures, and omens. A cloud resembling a pine tree appeared on the horizon by the nearby volcano. The cloud grew thicker, blocking out the midday sun and thrusting the town into darkness. Soon, thick ash and pumice fell from the sky in great globs, blocking the streets and clogging up the port. Some townspeople tried to flee, dragging wagons of belongings through streets filled with pumice and ash. Others cowered in their houses, praying that the storm would pass. Roofs strained under the weight of the pumice that piled ever higher. Then, sometime after dawn, black clouds and massive jagged bolts of lightning and fire descended upon the town. Swallowed by a great glowing red cloud, the town of Pompeii was no more. Okay, so you've probably heard of Pompeii and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but I have a feeling that most of us know, that it happened, but we're a bit fuzzy on the details. And there are a lot of weird details to learn about. So here are 10 things you might not have known about one of the most famous eruptions of all time, and the town unlucky enough to be right beside it. Let's start with the basics, and I'm not going to count this as a fact. Pompeii sits on the western coast of Italy, nestled near the foot of Mount Vesuvius. It was a working city with trade connections all across Italy, both by land and sea. Pompeii was also a town filled with culture, wealth, and politics, with fine villas, a forum, a theater, and gladiator arena. But in 79 CE, all of that was lost, and Pompeii became what we know it as today. That is, volcanic wreckage covered in ash and full of bodies. Many of its 10 to 20,000 inhabitants perished, including a famous author, naturalist, and philosopher by the name of Pliny the Elder. So now we've got our who's and what's sorted out. Let's get into the stuff that you might not have known. Although Pompeii kind of hogs all the attention, it actually wasn't the only town that was buried in the eruption. 3 other towns also succumbed to the power of Vesuvius that day. One was called Herculaneum, and it sat right at the base of the volcano. And just to be clear here, we're going with modern pronunciations of all of these town names, modern American pronunciations, so sorry for hardcore Latin buffs watching this. Herculaneum was kind of a resort town with fancy villas, baths, and swimming pools, while Pompeii was a working town with a somewhat middle-class population. Herculaneum was mostly the upper crust. When excavations at Herculaneum first began, archaeologists didn't find any human remains, so they thought that maybe most of its inhabitants had escaped. However, later excavations near where the shore of Naples used to be uncovered dozens of these missing bodies, who likely died as waves of hot gas careened down the mountainside. The second town was Stabiae, on the eastern end of the Bay of Naples. It's been described as a spa town, with walls covered in beautiful and elaborate paintings. And finally, there was Oplontis, a seaside town that included a lavish manor house that might have been home to the second wife of the Roman Emperor Nero. So when we think about the disaster of Pompeii, maybe we should spare a thought for its less famous neighbors. And just like Pompeii wasn't the only town, Mount Vesuvius isn't just one volcano. Technically, it's what's called a composite volcano system, or stratovolcano. This is when a type of volcano that caves inwards, called a caldera, has a new volcano cone that pokes through the older one. So the one we call Vesuvius is that newer cone that popped through a caldera called Mount Somma. The Vesuvius cone was built over 17,000 years as layers of ash, lava, and rock flows piled up over time. And those layers just keep piling on with every eruption, the last of which was in 1944, roughly 6 months after the Allies invaded Italy. Plus, that eruption probably wasn't the last. The volcano is very much still active. A study from 2002 analyzed the volcano's seismic activity over 20 years and found that the Vesuvius system has become more active over that time. Thankfully, the Italian government has an evacuation plan for the surrounding areas if the worst were to occur. Fool us once, Mount Vesuvius, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on us. Cannot fool us twice. Now, given that so many people died in their homes, you may have assumed that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was totally unexpected. The thing is, we have evidence that this was the big crescendo in a long chain of seismic events that this little town had dealt with. Pompeii had been hit year after year by avalanches and earthquakes right up until the end. In 2013, archaeologists examined core samples taken from all over Pompeii and saw centuries of rock, ash, and even people's belongings buried layer upon layer. That told them that the town was pretty used to being at the mercy of nature well before 79 CE. Maybe the most notable natural disaster before the famous eruption was a massive earthquake in 62 CE, which the town still hadn't fully recovered from by the time Vesuvius got all explodey. Sadly, no one seemed to suspect that the earthquake could be a sign of Vesuvius reawakening after a period of dormancy, until it was too late. Now, when the eruption did finally happen, it wasn't a quick one-and-done event. The entire ordeal took 2 days from start to finish, based on accounts from Pliny the Elder's nephew, creatively named Pliny the Younger. Pliny Jr. described how the events unfolded in 2 letters to the Roman historian Tacitus. First, he saw an odd tree-shaped cloud in the distance around midday. Then, pumice and burnt stones started raining down a few hours later, and tremors shook the buildings in town. That evening, dark volcanic clouds blocked out the sun, and fire could be seen sprouting up from Mount Vesuvius. The next day, buildings began to collapse under the heavy weight of tons of ash and rubble. When the sun finally started to beam through the darkened sky some 48 hours later, Pompeii, Herculaneum, Stabiae, and Atlantis were buried under huge piles of debris. These letters from Pliny are an excellent account and are still often referred to today when retelling the fate of Pompeii, which is what we did at the beginning of this episode. But there's actually also volcanic evidence of what happened. By analyzing deposits in areas around Mount Vesuvius, scientists can see exactly how these layers of ejecta spewed out of the volcano. In a kind of volcanic forensics case, they found that the eruption happened in 3 phases. In the first phase, white frothy pumice rained down, followed by thick gray pumice that clogged the streets. This phase is called the Plinian phase, named after our friend Pliny the Younger. The second phase, called the glowing avalanche phase, is where hot gas, pumice, and ash flowed down on the town, and fire that looked like lightning forked the sky. At least, that's the way Pliny the Younger tells it. This produced the pyroclastic flows and surges you might have heard of, where molten hot debris rushed down the mountain, decimating anything in its way. All in all, it took nearly 2 days to go from business as usual to a total wasteland, which somehow seems like both a long time and also no time at all. So we've got a pretty good timeline of how the eruption unfolded, but something that's still a bit of a mystery is exactly when, in 79 CE, all this happened. At first, historians thought the eruption started on August 24th, based on translations of Pliny the Younger's letters. But studies of the silt around Pompeii and a coin found buried in the rubble suggested the date was sometime in November. And still other studies have said the eruption probably happened in autumn, not summer, based on how the wind spread ash from the volcano, as well as the kinds of foods people were eating and the heavy clothing they were wearing. Then, in 2019, researchers found some writing on a wall that was dated October 17th, and because it was written in charcoal, they think that it couldn't have been that old when Mount Vesuvius blew. It's still up for debate, but the latest consensus seems to be that the eruption probably happened in October or early November. So if anyone wants to make a Pompeii Remembrance Day holiday, that is probably the window to put it in. So if we don't know the date Mount Vesuvius blew, we still know a lot about that day, like how everyone died, right? Turns out that's about as clear as a sky full of ash, which itself seems like the most obvious culprit. The air was full of ash, so everyone who breathed it could have choked. And yeah, that is one hypothesis. A 2023 study using a technique called X-ray fluorescence analyzed which elements were inside the bones and plaster of some of the body casts. And don't worry, we'll get to those casts in a minute. The ratio of calcium and phosphorus in the casts told them that the first people to die probably asphyxiated on ash, and then later their bodies were kind of cooked which is a little horrifying. But there's also a bunch of evidence that the bigger threat was waves of hot gas and stone called pyroclastic surges. These hot gases lacked oxygen, meaning they'd suffocate anyone who breathed them in. And there is some evidence that these pyroclastic flows were deadly. For one, in Pliny the Younger's letters, he describes his uncle Pliny collapsing and dying from the fumes, not in a cloud of ash. This is all very dramatic. I cannot believe they were in the same room. Plus, when you look at the casts made of people who perished, they're often seen lying down in these relaxed, sleepy poses, which suggests they died slowly from suffocation. Modern reconstructions of how volcanoes erupt shows that the pyroclastic flows of hot gas are the biggest threat to human life. And a 2010 study using a combination of volcanological and anthropological data concluded that surges of 250 degrees Celsius gas 10 kilometers away would be enough to kill someone instantly, and that is what happened in Pompeii. Plus, other researchers have reached the same conclusion by studying the bones of people found on the beach at Herculaneum. The victims' skulls had these gnarly cracks with black charring around them. Now, full warning if you want to skip ahead a bit here, it gets a bit gruesome. The researchers concluded that these people basically vaporized in the oncoming surge of hot gas. The heat caused their brains to expand and then explode inside of their skulls. They also think this explains why their resting poses were so lifelike, because they didn't have time to react before they died. And while this research might seem gruesome, it's actually incredibly useful for figuring out how to best protect the 3 million people living around Mount Vesuvius today. Although some of those images are gonna stick with me for a while. But of course, this research needs funding, and also so do we. So here is a quick ad.
Thanks to Brilliant for supporting this SciShow video. If you watch SciShow because it's a way to learn reliable stuff anywhere with an internet connection, then Brilliant is totally in line with your interests. Brilliant is an online learning platform that helps you build real knowledge wherever you can get online. Like you could learn about coding in Python at your local pet store, or you could learn how to work with real data from Starbucks while you're getting your coffee. Brilliant makes it easy to learn right on your phone with lessons you can complete whenever and wherever you feel like it. You can learn on the go at brilliant.org/scishow, the QR code on the screen, or at the link in the description. You'll get 20% off an annual premium Brilliant subscription and the first 30 days for free.
Now, this next entry is a little bit meta. It's not so much about Pompeii, but about what we know about Pompeii. Pompeii is considered one of the best archaeological sites in the world, and that's at least partly because archaeology, as we think of it today, was pretty much born here. Now, that's not to say people weren't digging up ancient ruins before Pompeii. For instance, 2,600 years ago, Babylonian kings dug up ancient temples to learn about previous monarchs. But archaeology was more about the rich and ruling class and, shiny things, not about learning about regular people. To do that, most scholars turned to written texts, not to evidence in the great wide world. All those treasures only mattered to people if they were valuable, not educational. But that changed at Pompeii. Some of the first planned excavations that we know of happened in Pompeii and Herculaneum. In 1748, the King of Naples, Charles III, organized systematic excavations led by military engineer Carl Weber, which were way different from the haphazard and treasure-seeking digs others had done. These original excavations marked a shift from thinking about the history of just the wealthy toward studying average people and how they lived. Archaeology became more about mapping, identifying, and recording than it did about just finding cool stuff. Then in the 1860s, the Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli created a new excavation system, one where he divided the city up into blocks to make excavation more efficient. He also had everyone document their finds in a register and take photos so they could save as much information and context around every item as possible. So in a lot of ways, many of the things we now know about the past were only possible thanks to Pompeii. And one of the most iconic things to come out of Pompeii's excavations are the casts of people who perished there. These casts were made by Fiorelli and his team, not by the volcano itself. They'd noticed that there were hollows in the ash layer where people's bodies had been, and they wanted to save the shapes while also digging below the ash. So the team would pour plaster into the open voids in the ash, making a perfect replica of their shape before brushing the ash away. But even though this makes bodies look well preserved, preserved, the remains inside are really hard to study. Most of these casts don't even contain an entire skeleton. In fact, in one study, when researchers scanned 26 casts using X-rays, they found that none of their skeletons were 100% complete. See, before DNA analysis and carbon dating, some archaeologists didn't think skeletons were that useful, so sometimes bones were just removed. Hindsight is 20/20, I guess. And that's, as you might expect, not the only way that those early excavations may have done some damage. It turns out that the plaster itself may have caused some problems for preservation. Bones naturally have tiny little pores in them, and when plaster gets into those pores, it can mess with the chemical composition of the bones, making them harder to study in the future. But in a 2023 study, researchers found a clever way around this problem. They were able to quantify just how the chemical composition of bones from Pompeii changed because of the cast making by comparing them to similar remains from Spain. That now gives them a reference point so they could figure out which changes were caused by the plaster and which were caused by other things, like the heat of the explosion. In any case, making these casts may have done more harm than good, though I am sure Fiorelli's heart was in the right place. Now, despite problems with the casts, recently scientists have been able to get new information from the material that is there. And that is thanks to new methods for extracting and sequencing DNA. So even when the skeletons were left intact before casting, the super hot temperatures from the eruption pretty much obliterated any DNA in the remains, leaving just tiny sections of genetic material. And that limited how much geneticists could learn from it. But in 2022, scientists sequenced the genomes of 2 individuals using newer sequencing methods and well-preserved samples of ancient DNA from a part of the skull called the petrous bone. And they were able to use this DNA to learn about migration. See, with Pompeii at the middle of this huge trade network, they wanted to know if the people who lived in Pompeii were all from there, or if it was common for out-of-towners to settle down there. And it turns out one of these individuals was very local and had DNA that looked pretty similar to Mediterranean people today. But he also likely wasn't a slave, since they were often brought in from other parts of the empire, like North Africa or the Middle East. What's even stranger is that the scientists noticed he had holes in his vertebra, and when they analyzed DNA from those bones, they found Mycobacterium tuberculosis. That's right, even ancient Romans got tuberculosis.
Sorry, did I hear the word tuberculosis?
Who was that guy? Anyway, and as archaeologists and geneticists uncover and sequence even more DNA, they're having to rethink some of their theories about how people lived in ancient Pompeii. In 2024, for example, scientists sequenced DNA from 4 individuals found in one of Pompeii's more luxe dwellings called the House of the Golden Bracelet. And it's called that because one of the individuals inside was found wearing a pretty hefty gold bangle. So that's not what they called it back then. The group of 4 consisted of 2 adults, one much taller than the other, and 2 children. The smaller adult was wearing said fancy bangle, and the group of 4 were huddled together at the time they all died. So between that and other context clues, historians had previously assumed that they were a husband and wife and their 2 children. But according to the DNA, both of the adults were male, and none of the 4 were genetically related. That led researchers to reevaluate what the Pompeian household structure could have been, and it says a lot about the closeness of social bonds between non-relatives. Maybe family didn't just mean blood family and could include slaves, friends, or adopted children. It's also worth mentioning that this doesn't mean that these 2 adults couldn't have been a couple. If anything, all it tells us is that in Pompeii, a family could have been a lot more than spouses and their biological children. Other DNA-based studies have been able to reconstruct some individuals' hair and eye colors and suggest that people living in Pompeii were descended from those in the Eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia. These recent studies just go to show that there's still so much to learn or relearn about Pompeii. Which brings us to our last little fact. There's still a ton that we do not know about Pompeii and the eruption. Like, even though archaeology was basically born here, the work is far from finished. As much as 1/3 of Pompeii has yet to be excavated, so who knows what might be hiding underneath all that ash and rubble. Plus, as we come up with new techniques like genetic analysis, archaeologists open up new pathways to understanding more about the things that have been excavated. It's just wild to me to think of, like, Giuseppe first excavating this stuff, having no idea that someday some esoteric molecule inside of a bone would let us know that, like, that person had TB, or that these people weren't related to each other, and who knows what techniques we'll have in the future. We could figure out their eye colors, which is what makes this such an important site for our understanding of ancient Rome. So now you know that there is a lot more to Pompeii's story than the fact that a nearby volcano blew up. Like Vesuvius itself, research is still active. And maybe soon we'll have even more facts to add to the list about how these people lived, not just how they died.